this idea that religion is something bad. It's something that doesn't belong in post-Enlightenment society. It's irrational. It starts wars. And if we really need to understand religion at all, then that understanding should be put to the service of getting rid of it, ultimately. What's your response to that?
Well, that's obviously a provocative statement in its way, and perhaps I could respond with a sort of counter-provocation, which is that is, in a sense, a religious statement in itself, in that it makes a kind of absolute claim that is asserting the supremacy of a secular Enlightenment worldview. And I'd argue we should be approaching these issues very much from a neutral perspective. And sadly, one of the consequences, arguably, of the Enlightenment was the French Revolution, which was an attempt to stamp out religion and resulted in considerable violence itself. I would agree that religion is a factor in wars and violence, but seldom the sole one. But I'd also suggest the historical record suggests that militant atheism, not only in the French Revolution, but, for example, in Stalinist Russia, can be a factor as well. So I suggest that the issue is we need to understand both sides of this coin, of the factors that can provoke extreme violence, whether they're religion or indeed the attack on religion.
So yes, as we become more globalized, more multicultural, regardless of how much you might like religion, it's quite apparent that it's not going away, right?
Yes, indeed. I mean, back in the 80s, people did perceive religion as going away, that the secularization was a kind of sort of inexorable trend, at least in the West. But I think academic opinion has very much swung round on that over the last 20, 25 years or so. And whatever we may think about religion, there's an awareness that in major globalized multicultural cities such as London and Sydney, religion is there to stay, and it may, in some places and in some contexts, actually be growing stronger.
You've said that religious literacy doesn't necessarily require extensive factual knowledge. Why not? And if not, what does it require?
Well, basic factual knowledge can indeed be useful. But my key point is that religious literacy is rather more about understanding and respecting difference, and also respecting the integrity of other people's belief systems, even if they may sometimes seem very strange to us. And it's also about understanding complexity. And to some extent, identikit factual knowledge about what, say, Christians or Muslims supposedly believed can actually be something of a hurdle in that respect, because, in fact, many Christians have very diverse views that differ from other Christians, likewise among Muslims and other major religious groups. So it's important that factual knowledge doesn't reinforce stereotypes. It should be encouraging people to challenge them, to understand the rich diversity of religion.
Yeah, it often seems to me on this particular point that if there is one fact that people really need to know about religions, it's that they're fluid, they're malleable, they change with cultural history, and it's pretty much, it's impossible to say that Islam believes this or Christians believe that, because it just keeps changing.
Absolutely. I would say there are some key facts that define them, that Christians believe in some sense that Jesus was the incarnate Son of God. Muslims believe that Muhammad was a prophet of God. But beyond that, there is enormous diversity within traditions, and assumptions that a particular individual or even a particular textbook gives a definitive view can actually be quite misleading.
Well, you've called for greater religious literacy within religious groups, which I find very interesting. Can you give me an example of where that religious literacy within a religious group is needed?
Oh, well, as a Christian, I'd sometimes like to nudge some of my co-religionists to pay more attention to what Jesus said, and perhaps sometimes more to the point didn't say about sex. I wouldn't go into that in detail, but I think that's one example. And among Muslims, my understanding is that the wearing of the burqa by Muslim women is more cultural practice than something that's explicitly commanded in the Quran. And so I would argue that it's helpful for Muslims to be aware of that in negotiating their position in Western societies where the burqa is found to be culturally problematic. So it's not saying that I'm condemning the use of a burqa, but I am saying I would argue that this is something on which religiously literate Muslims would show some flexibility.
Would you say that there's an extent to which a specific faith commitment or a deep commitment within one religious tradition is an obstacle or can be an obstacle to religious literacy?
Yes and no. Yes, if it's so deep, so entrenched that there's an inability to see other points of view. But on the other hand, I think often people with profound religious commitments of their own are precisely the people who are able to appreciate deep commitments in others, recognizing diversity without sacrificing their own principles. So I think it does very much depend on the makeup of the individual and how they articulate and feel that commitment.
How do you see the media in, well, I would say the West, but maybe in the UK particularly, and the level of religious literacy there? Do you feel there's a serious deficit?
It certainly could be better. I think sometimes the media is guilty of stereotyping, but I think those of us who are critical of the media do need to understand the inevitable pressures of journalism, the need to have an eye-catching headline, the need to meet a deadline, and I'd want to be respectful of that. And I'd also acknowledge the extent to which there are some very knowledgeable, high-quality journalists out there who do have a strong background in religion. Nevertheless, I think there is a problem with journalists who avoid religion or scared of it unless it really sort of hits them in the face as an inescapable aspect of a story, and then perhaps they rather misunderstand it. But I think that then sometimes it's an issue of sort of bias in the overall coverage, not so much as in the story itself. What I'd argue for is the need for media to be more religiously literate in terms of engaging more with the good news stories about religion, about where religious groups are active, for example, in addressing serious community issues and engaging with each other in bridging community divides. I think that kind of story is not as well represented in the media globally as it should be, and does lead to those reinforcements of those kind of public stereotypes about religion we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I take your point there. I mean, it often seems to me that even among religiously literate journalists, there is still a sort of adversarial relationship. That's the default setting between the journalist and religion stories. It's go to the tension, go to the drama or what's wrong, you know. And of course, there is a lot going wrong.
Yes, indeed. And I acknowledge the challenge for journalists that it's often difficult to tell a good news story, because a good news story is sometimes precisely about articulating what hasn't happened, about the patient work of community groups to bridge misunderstandings and thereby prevent a kind of sort of outbreak of communal sectarian violence. But that's, I think, can be quite difficult for journalists to articulate.
It does seem to me sometimes, in spite of everything we've just been saying, that the media seem to be getting more religiously literate in a sense. If we compare the media responses to the recent Westminster attack, for example, in London, with responses to the London bombings in 2007, there seems to be a more nuanced understanding than there was 10 years ago of the ways, of the relationships that exist between terrorism and Islam, for example. Do you see it that way?
Yes, I would agree with that. I think the reporting of the attack on Westminster Bridge pretty clearly and sort of early on made the point that this individual appeared to be quite marginal, even to organised Islamic terrorism as far as people are aware, and not using it to demonise a whole community. I do think still the point might be decoupled even more from points about Islam in this case. I mean, I'm conscious that there are sort of other horrific incidents where individuals run amok or cause multiple deaths in tragic accidents, and they're not immediately attributed to religion.
So how does one go about improving religious literacy within a society?
Well, in the long term, I mean, schools are crucial in terms of good religious literacy education in schools. And I stress I wouldn't see this as just a matter of formal religious education in the syllabus, but about bringing an understanding in religion into related areas of the syllabus, such as the study of history or classes on citizenship, for example. I think it's very important that religious literacy isn't seen as some kind of part of a God spot ghetto. And higher education is also important in terms of the influence on leaders, opinion formers. And I'd make a similar point that it's not just courses on religion that should be engaged with religion. But I'd also stress again the role of the media, because that is a key influence on people who are outside formal education. And that's why I do think it's so important that the media sort of leads society in that respect, in its understanding of religion rather than following it.
How about government and the need for religiously literate policy and legislation? Is there a deficit of that there in the UK?
Yes, although I think there are serious efforts to address it. I mean, as an aside, I could be rude about the US at the moment with the I think the sort of Trump travel ban showing significant issues of lack of religious literacy. In the UK, we have the Prevent programme, which is seeking to overcome people drifting towards terrorism, but it does have an ambiguous impact and reputation because of a risk that it alienates communities, especially Muslim communities, by stereotyping them in the endeavour to identify extremists. As a positive example of sort of government engagement with religion, I do think support for faith schools by government in the UK is generally a positive, and when they are under government control and with responsibilities for public finance, there is a good balance there. What I would like to see is some kind of government unit that is specifically concerned with religious responsibility. You may know that in the UK, the government a few years ago set up an office for budget responsibility. I think I'd like to see an office for religious responsibility.
Well, John, in your work as an advocate for religious literacy, do you feel that it's an uphill battle in the particular climate that we're in to convince people simply that they do need to pay serious, sympathetic attention to religion?
I would agree it's an uphill battle, but I'd also have a sense of making progress. I was very encouraged over the last year to participate in the progress of the UK Parliament a parliamentary group putting together a report on religious literacy, which I think makes a number of very sensible recommendations, which I'd like to see implemented. Whether government picks that up remains to be seen, but it is an indication that Parliament is latching onto the issues. And I think real concern about Islamist-inspired terrorism and more positively, the need to relate to and understand minority religious communities in the UK, including, of course, Christian ones, is encouraging people to feel they need to engage with this, even if they lack any particular religious interest or commitment of their own. So I do think that progress is being made, but I also worry about a polarity between the religious and the secular, that people also need to be understanding the secular, I think, in a more nuanced kind of way.
Secular literacy.
Yes, indeed. I think I would argue that that's something that religious people should be encouraged to understand, that the secular world is not necessarily militantly opposed to them, but may just be seeking to find space for sort of free exchange of views and perspectives, for diversity, rather than imposing a certain kind of secular ideology. And sometimes minority religious groups can feel themselves oppressed in a way that I think is certainly not the intention or nature of a wider society.
Well, of course, it's always worth pointing out that the secular is to some extent a religious invention. We're going to be doing a story on the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation for this program. So I always love making that point.
Yes, I'd agree with you. I think it goes back to St. Augustine in his distinction between the two cities, a city of God and the city of man. As coming from a seminal Christian thinker. And the point is that the secular is this world. It's the space in which government, diversity of views and religious organisations can operate.
Professor John Wolffe, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thanks very much for coming on RN Breakfast.
Well, great to be with you.